Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Wanted to welcome you to the 7th session of the Keep It On Summit. The Keep It On Summit is an insider track at RightsCon trying to help civil society and various stakeholders try to push back against internet shutdowns. So over the past couple of days, we've done an overview, everything we know about shutdowns. We've talked about circumvention. We've talked about personal stories of what it's like to experience an internet shutdown. We've also talked about new frontiers in measurement. How do we document and measure them? We also talked about the costs of internet shutdowns and gaps in our economic understanding of what they mean. Although there is agreement that they definitely harm economies, they certainly harm human rights. We've already covered definition of internet shutdowns. And today is a really exciting moment because we've heard from various stakeholders, technologists, academics, and civil society groups, people who've been on the front lines of the struggle in India, in Gambia, in Pakistan, all over the world. But this is now an exciting moment for us because of these are member states of the Freedom Online Coalition who are going to speak about this topic and share an important announcement and statement that they've made. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Andrew from Global Partners Digital. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Deji. So I'm Andrew Pudifat. I'm the Executive Chair of Global Partners Digital, and we're the support unit to the Freedom Online Coalition. Before I begin, we've got a fairly sort of thin audience, and I can see a few people at the back. If we're going to run roving mics to try and have a conversation, it would be helpful if everybody moved up a bit and you're in one group, because then the people with the mics could reach you more easily. If obviously you've just come in to do your email, have a quiet sleep, check your mobile phone and not really bother with a conversation, then please stay where you are, because I don't want to disturb you. But if you're actually interested in the topic of the conversation, the more you group together, the easier it will be for us to actually make sure we have a conversation that flows. That's great, thanks. Before I make any introductory remarks, the convention at RightsCon is that each of the speakers introduce themselves. So I'm going to ask, without naming the person, my colleague on the left to introduce himself and then pass the mic along. I think it should work automatically, but...
Thank you, Andrew, for this non-introduction of me. I'm Joost Bunk. I'm with the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Human Rights Department. I'm focusing on internet freedom and human rights online. And we launched the Freedom Online Coalition back in 2011. And now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague.
Thanks, Joost. So I'm Jason Pielmeyer, and I work in the U.S. State Department in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, where I head up our Internet Freedom and Business and Human Rights team.
Hi, my name is Fadzai Madzingira. I'm the policy analyst for the Africa Public Policy team at Facebook. My focus is internet rights, and more specifically, internet disruptions and blockings.
Hi, my name is Mishi Chaudhry. I am the president at Software Freedom Law Center, India. And it seems I also am the biggest fan of FOC. You can tell by my dress.
Marvelous. It's the matching colors, actually. I have to say, the men let us down a little bit today because they haven't got the green. So the Freedom Online Coalition, for those who don't know, is a coalition of now 30 countries. It started as 11 countries back in 2011 at a meeting in The Hague. It's now grown to 30, and the 30 countries work together to promote internet freedom globally. They do that through a number of activities, through diplomatic coordination, through issuing joint policy statements, providing mutual support, and developing policy and outreach with both civil society and the business community. So and we're now 5 years into the Freedom Online Coalition, and we're in the middle of a fairly extensive review of its structure and operations, which is hopefully going to conclude at the time of the next Stockholm Internet Forum meeting in May. But the subject today is the question, as one of the threads of the conference, is network disruptions. And yesterday, the FOC issued a statement on network disruptions, along with recommended actions for governments. And that statement's available at the bit.ly link here for those of you who haven't seen it. So hopefully, I know the internet's not brilliant here, but if you're able to access it, you'll get a sense of what the network, of what the statement says. So I'm going to start with just some questions to the panel, but I'm very keen to have a more participatory conversation. And so if you do have questions or thoughts or ideas that you want to throw in, there'll be plenty of time to do that because the session runs till about 11:45. And I don't anticipate the initial opening remarks taking a great deal of time. But maybe, Jason, I could start with you. Could you give some background for people here as to what led the FOC to developing the statement?
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, so it's really a pleasure to be here and specifically to be on this panel with my esteemed fellow panelists. So sort of looking backwards and talking about how we came to this topic of network shutdowns, I think is useful in part because it also illustrates the way in which the coalition works and how we engage with and are informed by our sort of non-state stakeholders. So, I want to sort of upfront give particular shout out and recognition to Access Now and to Deji in particular for all the work that they've been doing around this issue. All of the sort of issues and activities that fall under the broad umbrella term of network shutdowns have actually been on our radar for quite some time. And I think it's worth also pointing out, sort of doing some quick research into this topic, that actually the first sort of formal statement that I could find on this issue was actually issued by the Global Network Initiative in May of 2013. They put out a statement that said network shutdowns go beyond Syria, which obviously talked about network shutdowns in Syria, but also called out particular shutdowns in China, Mozambique, and Pakistan. That sort of statement and other things that were going on in those countries and other countries led us as a coalition, the Freedom Online Coalition, in August of 2014, to issue a statement on restrictions on access to social media. So not network shutdowns broadly, but specifically the shutdown of social media sites. And that statement expressed deep concern about the increase in the number and types of observed restrictions on access to social media platforms, including temporarily or permanently banning access to social media sites. It also strongly condemned, in particular, the wholesale blocking of social media sites to restrict individuals from exercising their human rights online. That was, I think, a very kind of prescient statement, obviously focused specifically on one particular type of internet site, but it just illustrates that these issues have been around for some time. I think Access, according to the Keep It On sort of portal on the Access website, one of the first statements that Access put out was just a couple months later in 2014, specifically on Tajikistan. And then the campaign, of course, has continued ever since then. I think the formal launch, according to the website, was June of last year, which is interesting because it sort of coincides very well with the Human Rights Council session that was taking place in Geneva, and a number of FOC member states are members of the core group that does the biannual Internet Freedom Resolution there at the Human Rights Council, including the US. That the primary sponsor is Sweden, another member of the coalition. And so I don't think it's giving away too much inside politics to say that there was a lively debate and discussion of these issues, which fortunately ultimately resulted in language in that June 2016 Human Rights Council resolution condemning unequivocally measures to intentionally prevent or disrupt access to or dissemination of information online in violation of international human rights law, and calling on states to refrain from and cease such measures, which was a really important and seminal moment. I mean, the Human Rights Council resolutions are not in and of themselves binding in the sense that they are not going to sort of immediately lead to reversals of shutdowns, but they are sort of the best way for the global community of states to speak normatively on these issues. And so getting that language in there was really important, not least because other members of the core group at the UN include Turkey and Brazil. So it's just notable. Just to kind of follow the timeline then from June of last year until today, October of last year, we hosted our FOC conference in Costa Rica, and we had a panel on this subject, and Access was there for that, which was great. A few days later, GNI launched its report on the economic impact of disruptions on internet connectivity, which we cite to in the statement we put out yesterday. and I think has been a really important and useful contribution to the broader discussion. And then just a couple months after that at the IGF in Mexico, Access presented to us a stack of 47,000 names of folks who had signed on to their petition, which called on governments to publicly commit to keeping the internet on and highlighting the human rights and economic impacts of shutdowns. So all of that was kind of the long buildup that led us as a coalition to say, look, we really should use our sort of coalition to bring further attention to these issues. And so the result of that is this statement that Andrew mentioned, which is available as of yesterday. I hope you all have had a chance to see it, or if you haven't yet, that you will take a look at it. Joost will go through a little bit more of what's in there, but I think it's just worth noting that this is the first time that, in addition to kind of a normative statement that's written in sort of diplomatic language, we also have a series of good practices for government spelled out kind of in an annex to that. So we certainly hope that this is useful. We intend to use it as governments to collectively engage with countries that are facing some of these challenges, to urge them to keep it on. But we also hope that it's useful to all of you, whether you are a telecom provider or an NGO, whether you're based in a country that is experiencing network restrictions or internet restrictions, or are just passionate about these issues. We think this can be a really useful tool, so we hope it works out that way. So I think I'll leave it there. Pass it back to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Jason. So Joost, as Jason said, there's actually a set of recommendations or good practice for governments, which is, I think, a new development for the FOC. It's not added that to a policy statement before, which I think many people would welcome. Can you tell us a bit about how you see, or the options for governments cooperating multilaterally or bilaterally to actually promote the policy?
Yes, and thanks, Jason, for setting out what led to FOC launching this statement. Before I address what we can do as governments internationally, I would like to point out two important arguments which are in the statement, which we can use in the international dialogue. First and foremost, of course, there is this human rights aspect. It should be noted that internet has become the infrastructure of almost all other human rights. You can express yourself, you can be yourself, and you can connect with peers through the internet. Therefore, the internet has become, in a sense, a facilitator of human rights. And blocking and shutting down the internet is therefore a violation of international human rights, as was stated by the Human Rights Council in 2016, as Jason mentioned, and by the Special Rapporteur and the OSCE. Therefore, the trend nowadays is particularly worrisome. However, states may not be most receptive to this argument, as you might understand. So it's therefore also important to point out short-term and long-term economic and societal growth arguments. States all around the world are aiming for quick and easy economic growth through ICT developments and digital business. A crucial part for this is A, that there is internet, B, that it is working, and C, that it is stable. Disrupting this will in short term lead to people losing their source of income, since their business is out of office and they are no longer unemployed. The cost calculations provided by GNI and by the Brookings Institute are great examples of the huge impact of this. And on the long term, it will prevent people from pursuing businesses in ICT and internet which rely on the internet. Because of this, states and societies can miss out on the quick and economic growth which IT brings, therefore widening the digital divide. With these two arguments in the back of the mind, I can shed some light on what we as states can do on an international level. However, I would like to point out it's very important to not only see it as a state's issue, but we have to have a multi-layered, multi-stakeholder approach to this, in which the input from other stakeholders is very important. So the first layer might well be the statements by Human Rights Council or by the FOC, and these are the stepping stones on which we can build further. So we say we need to start beating the drums on the internet shutdowns. And next step is to consolidate this in international diplomacy. It needs to stay on the agenda of the Human Rights Council, it needs to stay on our agenda, and needs to become an issue on other agendas as well. And we need to bring it up in other different fora of the United Nations or internationally. When we have this international attention, we need to build upon this in regional and other technical fora, such as the European Union, the ITU, and the African Union. The FOC, as Jason stated, is only 30 states, but by reaching out to other regional fora, we can increase our coalition and increase the sound. For example, the Netherlands is now striving to use human rights working groups, review mechanisms to point out also internet shutdowns. And lastly, when we have all these beats running, when we have all this sound on internet shutdowns, we can use the FOC as a vehicle for direct diplomacy, or we can address this in our own bilateral diplomacy initiative, and then we can use the statements we have to build upon. For example, we are bringing in our direct diplomacy the internet shutdowns to the attention when possible, and in order to be successful in this, we need to be both idealistic on the human rights side and pragmatic on the economic argument. However, this is only one layer of the multi-stakeholder approach. The next level is improving the capacity and advocacy skills of people in the affected countries. We simply cannot fly in and turn on the internet. Societies need to influence their own policies, and we as government and the stakeholder community as a total needs to help communities achieve this. We all believe it's important to act now because we need to prevent people from getting used to internet shutdowns. Internet shutdowns should not be best practices for repressive regimes. A shutdown is local, but the internet is global, and therefore we all have a responsibility to address this. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Misha, coming to you. Civil society has been concerned about network disruptions, I think, for several years. So I think it'd be helpful for you if you could just tell us a little bit about the kind of civil society activity you're aware of around the issue, insofar as you are aware of it. But also, how do you think civil society itself can react to these network disruptions, and how can it collaborate with the wider business community or governments to actually try and challenge them or roll them back?
I'm aware of what civil society has been doing in terms of, I think most of the organizations had been tracking a lot of scalpel level censorship by the governments, which is website takedown, etc., which started much earlier and still goes on. My own organization had been cataloging what various censorship measurements had been taken. And then we started seeing regional level blackouts, total blackouts of a region. And unfortunately, we were pushed to start tracking because there wasn't much data which was available. We launched the internetshutdowns.in. It's a map-based tracker. It just collects a lot of data about where the blackouts happen. In a democratic country like ours, mostly, at least the assumption is that this won't happen. And there is a federal level legislation which has enough checks and balances, which also speaks to, I think, some of the good practices what FOC has recommended. I'll just want to go a little more granular here. States do have information technology legislations or such other laws, which have checks and balances for blocking access to information. But often that's not what is being used. I think now the authorities are much more mature about what is it that they want to go at, and when it's much regional and localized, at least where I'm studying, in India last year, 2016, saw 30 shutdowns in our country itself, 30. 2017, we've already had 7. What we noticed was, and this is also where civil society learned quite a lot, was that we started writing first to the federal ministry about it, and also the Prime Minister's office. And then somebody in one of the states, an opposition chief minister, pointed it out to us that why are you telling them? Because that's not what is being used here. And the more we looked into it, we understood that traditional police power is now being used. So criminal procedure code or penal codes, there are provisions to prevent unlawful assembly. And that has become the go-to mechanism to disrupt the entire network. when those police powers are used, often you will not see as much of coverage which happens. There's also no checks and balances because nobody has ever thought about use of such sections for taking the internet down. But I think a district magistrate in one region started the trend. It worked so beautifully, then they replicated it. And with 30 shutdowns and 7 already, yesterday, my organization surprisingly got a response to a FOIA request where we actually have the order which was sent by the district magistrate to the various telecom companies, platform companies. So we're learning more about the mechanism of what is being used. I was in conversation with a few telcos and platform companies, and I was put in a situation where sometimes you're like, am I supposed to be proud of my work? Because they said we are using your data to understand shutdowns. I'm like, yeah, that doesn't sound very good. My resources are like, I don't know, 1/1,000,000th of yours. I have no access, no nothing. And if my data is the most updated data, it's very good for my team. I'm going to send them some Belgian beer. But I don't think that's where we are going. And they said, they pointed out something very important. Many legislations have gag orders built in. So something where you say about issue public statements that highlight such instances of network disruption and coordination. Other governments, then if they actually start pointing it out, it shines that light. And in a country like mine, where the population is 1.25 billion with 28 states, if it's happening in a localized region, and it's not in my backyard, it's not in Delhi, Bangalore, or Bombay, most of the people are like, shrug it and let's go on, because they can still buy the latest pair of shoes or watch their Netflix show online. It doesn't bother them. And what I'm trying to say is that legal justifications which are offered for shutdowns, including the prevention of unlawful assembly, are far too narrow to sustain any measure with this breadth of undesirable social consequences, especially in societies which are now becoming digitized. In mine, there is a push for cashless India. Digital India is a big campaign for the government of India. There is no digital India without the digital in it. And that digital doesn't work without any internet connection. And exigent circumstances may make it reasonable in some constitutional order to prohibit certain forms of speech, but such kind of a routine urgency is not sufficient justification for limiting all forms of communications. Because if your economic, educational, private lives and of tens of millions of citizens is being now lived on the internet, then there is no holistic thinking. And unfortunately, the human rights arguments are not working. So I'm very glad that you give us alternatives in terms of talking about it. $968 million lost as per the Brookings report in India alone, when the total is 2.4 billion. We like being high in numbers, but not when the losses are such. But I will say the economic argument has gotten at least some attention. Ritu is sitting in the audience. Her organization is supporting our thing and working on it. There are various other organizations working. We've appropriated Keep It On because it's pretty, because Deji's work is so great. Being part of various other organizations is helpful in terms of exchanging data and information. But what we do need is an ability to collect accurate data. Some of these regions don't have access or they are remote, and if the media reports are our only resource, our only sources, they're only as good as our sources are, and they come out much later. And another thing which I'll say in our regions, and you can correct me later, of course, in the countries we come from, most of the population in India, 345 million out of the 367 million internet subscribers are mobile internet users. They are not broadband fixed line users. And the strategies of measurement, whether it is great work by UNI or MLab, they are made for fixed line internet. They don't work for us. Various ways of collecting that data is not useful for us because, and there are many great projects out there, but many of them are also for only specific websites or applications. That's not what we are facing. We're facing complete blackouts. So one website at a time, although it's useful to measure, but we do not know how to measure these regional blackouts.
Thanks. So there's a kind of gap in our ability to understand what's happening because of the mobile internet access, rather. Yeah, okay, that's really important. Thank you. Fadzai, with Facebook, you know, it's a political platform for many, many people. So you're probably the reason why the internet's being shut down in many parts of the world. So perhaps you could justify that. But I know, obviously, in Africa, there have been a number of shutdowns, particularly around elections. So I guess it'd be good from our point of view to get your sense of what's the experiences that your company's had of the shutdowns, how do you respond to them, and how do you think there would be opportunities to work with the governments who are committed to try and oppose them to actually roll back what seems to be a growing tendency?
Thank you. Just to reiterate, thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here and to be able to talk about some of the amazing work the Africa policy team is doing. And to that fact, just to confirm, so that way I don't have to correct you later, you're right. Mobile users are the largest number of users across sub-Saharan Africa as well. So, and that is something that we're aware of when we think about detection and monitoring and so forth. In terms of my work, because I work with the Africa team, a lot of my focus recognizes that the majority of shutdowns are happening within our region. As a born and bred Zimbabwean and as a Facebook employee, these are issues of concern. As Facebook, our mission is to connect people and allow our users to share. So obviously, any barriers to that, it's necessary for us to combat those. Alex, I think, spoke really well to why we care about these issues yesterday, and that they go beyond just a business perspective, but as you pointed out, it is very political and related to issues of expression, assembly, and we're very proud of the fact that our users can use our tools for these things. So just to make sure that I cover everything, I'm going to speak to where Facebook stands, what we are doing and with whom, and then maybe a few thoughts on the amazing statement that was released yesterday. So obviously, as Facebook, we oppose shutdowns, throttling, disruptions of the internet, whether it's websites, apps, and services, and we're deeply concerned by this growing trend. Access Now, I think, recorded 3 times as many shutdowns in 2016 alone than the 2 years before that. What that means for me, because I'm a lawyer by background, and I'm sorry, I'm recovering. What that means, yeah, I know, I'm sorry. I am so sorry. What that means for me is it's necessitated the need for more research to understand better why is it that we're seeing this growing trend. Which is why Facebook supported the research last year with Deloitte and Brookings to determine the economic impact. So in terms of what Facebook does, we work with governments and NGOs so that way they can better understand our tools and better use our products. We have fantastic initiatives that show governments about the benefits of using our platforms to communicate with constituents. And so if you'll allow me just to give a quick example of, because you mentioned elections, Ghana. Ghana in 2016 had one of the most competitive elections they have had in their history. And despite serious concerns earlier in the year that they would shut down the internet and combine that with a strong narrative around elections and disruptions, they did not do so. And I think that's important to acknowledge and to look at in terms of a case study. Most of the candidates used social media to influence and to win supporters for their campaigns. The Ghanaian police and security services actively used social media to spread public safety messages and to share updates. The Electoral Commission used both Twitter and Facebook to share details around the voting process and around the counting. They also used Twitter and Facebook to combat allegations around the hacking of their website and to counter any narratives around election results, which could have led to violence and then didn't. Ghana's coalition of local observers and other civil society encouraged their users to tweet at them with regards to any issues and concerns that they may have seen across the polls. And then Ghanaians across the country were able to follow these things via WhatsApp and Facebook. And what that says to me is that government recognized the benefits of being able to use these tools and were able to use them for the safety of their own citizens. And we work very closely with enforcement and with electoral commissions, government, and NGOs in order to train them. So, and then just also to flag that if you as an NGO are interested in that sort of thing, then please feel free to approach me afterwards. In terms of what we're currently doing, we're partnered with several organizations to investigate the root causes behind these shutdowns. We engage regularly with local organizations, with telcos, with government, in order to provide the resources that they need to quantify the impacts. So in my mind, the Brookings study was a fantastic first step. It was a very quick, dirty, being able to do the maths at the back of an envelope. What I'm realizing from a sub-Saharan African perspective is that we need to consider more regional focused research, especially in light of some of the particularities and context of our countries. So I'm thinking specifically of mobile money usage in Kenya, growing OSPs in Nigeria, huge informal economies such as the one in Zimbabwe, and that's not captured by classical economic research methodologies, and that is currently what we're looking into quite strongly. And we're also trying to think very specifically that, yes, the economic argument has been a huge push, but we also want to start looking into social political impact as well of when this is shut down. So health as well is very strongly impacted by such shutdowns. And that's where we're looking at. So you'll have noticed, like in my time here, that I have been furiously writing notes at all of these Keep It On sessions, because the role that I have right now, both at RightsCon but within region, is to learn as much as I can to understand why this is happening and what the impact is. And I think that we can work better to proactively prevent shutdowns if we understand better that context. So, of course, we applaud the joint statement, which makes clear reference to previous studies around the impact of shutdowns, requests governments to respect Article 19 and 21. The good practice guidelines, I think if I understand them correctly, basically ask governments to hold certain principles that I don't think any of us would find issue with, upholding human rights, transparent government. I'm very happy to see that they ask not only for bilateral government engagement when shutdowns occur, but also holistic multi-stakeholder engagement at a local level, which I think is also very important and often very ignored when these discussions are being had globally. So I'm eager to hear not only from other panelists where they think the gaps not the work is, but also where we should be focusing, and also eager to hear from the audience any ideas that they may have with regards to what research is needed and what we should be thinking about. Thank you.
I just want to supplement. So thank you, Fadza. That was really, really helpful. And I in particular appreciate you pointing out the Ghana case study as sort of a counterexample. We hear a lot about the countries that are shutting the internet down. I think one of the things that made the Ghana example so relevant was not only the fact that there were a bunch of other African countries who had, around the same time, had some level of internet restrictions and shutdowns around their elections, so there was kind of a regional trend. There was actually also a statement made by kind of a mid-level police official in the run-up to the election saying that the police were considering and might shut down the internet or restrict access to the internet in the context of the election there. Ghana is a member of the Freedom Online Coalition, and we were having these conversations internally as well as at some of these relevant venues that I detailed about in sort of the history of kind of run up to this at that time. And so ultimately, it was then President Mahama who actually came out and clarified that, no, we are not going to shut down the internet, which I think was extremely useful. But one of the people who really kind of was instrumental not only in sort of helping to clarify this issue internally in Ghana, but then ended up actually being a contributor to this draft statement that we just put out, is Kenneth Abdu Amanfo, who is the Deputy Director of ICT at the Ghana National Communications Agency. I want to recognize him in particular, and then sort of by way of that recognize the role that the FOC played in making sure that that Ghana as a government understood how that statement was raising concerns and potentially contradicting their commitments to the coalition. So I don't want to suggest that, but for the FOC, maybe there would have been a shutdown, because I think there are a lot of other really important reasons why Ghana didn't end up going down that path. But I think it is really important for us to learn from those examples. And you point out, all of the really good advocacy domestically, the way in which a lot of the key government institutions, including electoral institutions, had sort of already internalized and been planning on using the internet to help provide transparency and information around the election. And therefore, it would be sort of not only counterintuitive, but actually, prohibitive to them to be able to do their job if the internet had been restricted or shut down. So that kind of lesson, I think, is extremely useful, and we should look for more lessons like that. I also want to just second another thing that you said. The economic arguments are great to some extent, but when these shutdowns occur in the context of things like elections or protests, they tend to sort of fall away to the side. So pointing out, and I think Access has done a really good job, and I know there was a discussion earlier in the week on this, pointing out the human cost, right? So not just the sort of people not being able to get access to healthcare, but people not being able to coordinate with caregivers for their children or for elderly, people not being able to get transportation services when emergencies arise. Those examples that really kind of bring home the human cost of internet disconnection, I think, are extremely important. And I applaud Facebook and Access and others who are working to bring those stories to light.
Yeah, thanks. And I think the Ghana example is a good one to run to other governments, certainly in the region with the Kenyan election coming up, for example. I think if we can say to the Kenyan government, look, this was actually a positive benefit to keep it on in Ghana, and it actually worked, and it didn't cause the kind of violence and disruption that we know the Kenyan government is afraid of in terms of the elections. I think having these positive examples is much better than simply condemning them on a sort of set of abstract principles, to actually show how effective it is in promoting democracy and the human costs and human benefits. I think it's really valuable. So I'm going to throw it open now. Feel free to ask questions, but I think there's a lot of experience in the room. So I think we're also very interested in anyone who's experienced the network disruption and the reasons, what the experience was and why it happened, what you think the cause was. Anyone who's been advocating or arguing against network disruptions and has any lessons or interesting examples that we can draw upon, I think that would be very useful. If there are people involved in monitoring, particularly monitoring of mobile shutdown, any lessons you've got there, that would be kind of very helpful for us. And essentially anything, if you have any thoughts, advice, we'd also welcome that. So don't feel free to go beyond just the question to the panel, but obviously if you have questions, we're very happy to take them. So I'm going to kind of wander around, so I like wandering around with a mic, and see where we go from here. And okay. Other mics here, so start with this woman here, yeah, thanks.
I actually have kind of more of a cultural question. Darcy from BBG, counterpart with DRL in the OIF office. I'm new, so you don't know me. Because we're BBG, we have access to...
Do you want to say what BBG is for people?
Oh, sorry, Broadcasting Board of Governors. And for those that don't know that, it's VOA is a part of us, Voice of America. Just, hey, somebody asked me what VOA was, so the cultural question is actually this. If some of our reporters were to put out the news of Ghana and their success in keeping on the internet during the elections and push it out to other African countries who are starting to go through their own elections, how do you think that would play in their society? Because I know my area was the Middle East, and I know that pushing out certain Middle Eastern countries to other Middle Eastern countries was not culturally sensitive. So how culturally sensitive would that be if we did that in Africa? Thank you.
Fazia, I think that's for you, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, and I think that's a really important point, and I think it also came up in discussions yesterday. What we have found, and I made a very strong plug of this, was we work very, very closely with our local partners when it comes to providing this research. To give perhaps a very bad example, with Gambia, for example, what was found far far more effective was when Nigeria and Senegal were coming into this discussion rather than having Western bodies intervene in that discussion. And what we do is we provide these resources and trainings to local NGOs on the ground who often are trusted by government rather than so I'm speaking now as a Zimbabwean. I also recognize the difficulty of having some American walk in and say, this is how you should do it. But I suppose, so because what you also have to recognize is a lot of the narratives are often, from an African perspective, are often un-African. Where African countries are often eager to hear what other Africans are doing, when we switch on the news, we don't see that. We see what America is doing, what the UK is doing, what Europe is doing, and we don't get to see that actually this is what happened in Ghana, who's also another African country that has experienced the commodity crisis, another African country that's experienced past election violence. And when you see that, it's far easier to relate than to hear, oh, this is how France conducted peaceful elections. So if anything, we found that within the region, it's far easier, it's a lot better to advocate like this is what other African governments are doing rather than to advocate and compare from outside. Recently, Nigeria has started live streaming on Facebook their National Assembly sessions. And that was after several trainings, but also because they recognized that in Rwanda was using Twitter to engage with their constituents. So it's a constant in-region discussion among governments that perhaps this is a good idea. And we found that has been more effective in the last 2 years. So I don't know a lot about the Middle East and North African context, but I can definitely confirm in Sub-Saharan Africa, they respond eagerly to discussions with other regional governments than they do to outsiders, to use the broad outsiders. So.
Can I just ask, do you see I mean, maybe you and Misha or any of the panel, do you see a regional pattern to shut down? So is there a type of reason within India, for example, that's very different to the type of reason within Sub-Saharan Africa or elsewhere in the world? I mean, insofar as you're aware of that.
So, because I won't speak okay, so I mean, I very loosely say Africa, but my team covers 48 countries. So that's 48 different governments, thousands of languages, dialects. So it's, when I say Africa, I acknowledge that that is a broad and horrific generalization that I do not want to encourage. Africa is not a country. So I don't even know how I mean, they're very broad ones. So like you said, elections, for example, civil unrest and protests. But again, I wouldn't be able to speak specifically to be clear on that.
Not necessarily a pattern then. What about Misha, from your point of view?
We're a region in ourselves, so 28 states, 18 scheduled languages. No, I mean, I can't see any way of India actually trying to do anything in the region on this issue. I would also say, again, I can't stress enough that this is not even under the Indian federal government which is being done. It's with the state government under state police powers which are now being used. It does say that anytime there's an agitation, whether asking for affirmative action or perhaps it's about any kind of protest in the street, sometimes the excuses are as trivial as to prevent cheating in examination. So, but the power which is being used, it's not under the control of the federal government. I do not see how we actually go any further than that. And I must also say that my conversations with the law enforcement officers who are actually trying to use these powers and many of the times they have pointed out to one particular platform or something else and say, see, inflammatory messages are now being circulated. And there is an apprehension of real danger for us. It may not be clear and imminent, and that time you don't get into the legalities, as much as I love doing that for making just more money. But that's not when you get into those conversations and they're going to say, I'm responsible for law and order in this region. I'm going to go ahead and do this. And that's why I also want to say is that somebody had actually filed a petition in the state of Gujarat, went to the federal appellate court, asked and challenged such a thing. That petition went to the Indian Supreme Court, and the Chief Justice said it becomes very necessary sometimes for law and order, and dismissed the petition. So we've already exhausted that legal remedy to go to the highest court in our nation. And what we are trying to do right now is work with the regional chief ministers and also get the union ministry to make them understand when they have a process, perhaps they could also replicate the process, where there's a review committee, where the reasons are more explicit, where this is only in very exigent circumstances and does not become a way of life. What we're also trying to do is, in addition to all the fun and technical data, trying to figure out whether we want a probe or not and do fun stuff, but we're also trying to get, earlier, as you pointed out, some human stories out. What really happens when you actually have that? And I don't know how magically this appeared, but on this website, on the resources, we have what we collected. Some of it is anonymous, but some of the people were ready to give out their names about what happened when the net went down. And I think you said earlier about health. We heard from a surgeon in the Northeast, and she said, most of the hospitals are now putting patient data online. And when those servers go down, then when you are just doing your regular business of being a doctor, you have to figure out ways to access that information just to do your job. There, we heard somebody has completely put their entire business of textiles on WhatsApp. And the guy says, so for 4 days, I had 0 clients. I couldn't sell, I couldn't trade at all. And these are not people who actually have enough capital to go on. 4 days of no business means actually quite a lot on their livelihood. A student told us that he was in one of the regions and his parents could not transfer money. And I don't know how many of you noticed, but in November, 86% of our currency was taken out of our economy, which means demonetization. And there's a big push towards digital cashless India. And if I'm going to use my mobile phone to make all kind of payments and my mobile phone suddenly stops working because there's no internet data on it, I do not know how I actually conduct my family life, my business life, my social life. And it's just becoming much closer, and we're trying to get that data. And we don't want just statistics, because statistics are numbers and they don't move people as much, but they're also important. That's one kind of data we're collecting in order to say, okay, this is a real problem. I also want to say one thing is that perhaps we're maturing. Slowly we are trying to figure it out, so we don't know what, or maybe we should at least, or at least I want to know in my optimism, I think that maybe they themselves, the authorities haven't realized what this actually means for their own society. And because the rights, like living in digital India can be either a curse or a blessing, depending on how we will carry out our democratic values in this new age. But we also have the penal code, which can be used and twisted to do many different things. And I think shutdowns are such a negative expression of the idea of digital sovereignty, which is now gaining, I don't know what, but and they're just not meant for undemocratic societies is what we want to say, and it happens for various other reasons.
Okay, thanks. Any, yeah, Patrick from Ericsson.
Patrick Selis from Telia Company, the operator in Nordic Baltics and Eurasia, and also a member of GNI. So thank you for all of, and there is broad consensus. There are all these very good arguments against network shutdowns, and there is consensus, and also now manifested through the very welcome statement by the Freedom Online Coalition. So we've been doing some thinking within the GNI, how all of these good arguments and the leverage that we're building, the consensus all in this room, how that can be put into the decision making by policymakers when they are deciding whether or not to shut down the internet. So we are working on a one-pager where we try to put all of these very good arguments into a one page, which maybe an assistant or an IT minister or someone will have access to. We will try to get that in many languages. So I think when we now have this joint leverage and these statements and the consensus, I think a good discussions here at RightsCon is to be practical and say, when we will have that one-pager, hopefully by the Stockholm Internet Forum, how will we make that one-pager available for the decision makers around the world who are maybe considering shutdowns? Thanks.
Thanks, Joost. Can I come to you and just ask you what your advice back to GNI would be on that?
Well, first of all, thank you for this interesting question. We as the FOC, as governments, made good practices for governments, but it's a multi-stakeholder approach is the only viable way to resolve this issue. So actually we should aim together with the community to supplement our good practices for governments with good practices for telcos, with good practices for advocates, for NGOs. So we can have a bundle of good practices for all of the stakeholders involved, in which we then can present to governments and on which we can build further in our diplomacy, but also on which NGOs and telco operators can build upon in their own work, in their own societies. So I think it's important for us to, as governments, make a broad umbrella under which all the multi-stakeholders can, on their respective area, can add their own good practices and then a total picture we can present to the local communities.
Thanks. Jason, do you want to add anything to that? Or
No, I mean, I just say we welcome engagement by the GNI on this. I mean, as I noted in my remarks, GNI was kind of one of the first organizations to put this issue on the map back in 2012, and I think, as Joost pointed out, the idea that any one set of actors can address a troubling pattern like this alone is quixotic. We need to work together, and we need to do that at the global level, but we also need to make sure that we're doing that in the specific country context. And so really applaud the work that Mishi and her organization are doing, and the fact that Facebook is taking kind of regional approaches to these issues, I think is a really valuable lesson. So I think we're going to see more of that. I mean, this kind of gathering of folks who are working at the global level sort of helps to sort of set the stage then for that work to kind of percolate and be effective on the country by country and even within countries on the sort of regional level.
Yeah, I mean, I think a one-page statement.
Can I add very quickly?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
To your question as well, I also think, and because you made such an important point, is recognizing the stakeholders that you need to work with. To give a very good example, Lesotho in November last year, when the Prime Minister indicated serious considerations of shutting down the internet in order to stop what he considered hateful speech spreading online. And what was found was that he was dissuaded to do so by telcos and NGOs that provided the Brookings, the Deloitte research, as well as other examples of how he could counter that rather than shutting it down. So if you're looking to be effective in making sure that these one-pagers are in front of policymakers, the best route would be through telcos and civil society that are on the ground, that understand the work and that understand the research and can walk through with the policymaker. And it's not impossible. Lesotho, I thought, was a fantastic example where the regulator insisted that we need to sit down and discuss this and asked for public hearings, and thereafter the Prime Minister was convinced that the internet didn't have to be shut down. So and a one-page, I think, is a fantastic example, because that's a fantastic idea, because I think that's exactly what a policymaker wants to see. They want one clearly, like, this is why I shouldn't do it. So if we're looking for impact and effectiveness, then those local stakeholders would be the most valuable.
Yeah, I think you can never underestimate, in my experience, how little many public officials actually understand the internet. And actually, I mean, I've actually had people say to me, senior positions in the Ministry of Information in a country I won't name, I don't really understand the internet, and he's in charge of regulating it. And so I think not just having the statement, but having the telecommunications companies, the social media companies, the civil society organizations, and some of the local businesses saying, if you do this, it will be catastrophic for our society, can actually be incredibly useful. And I think that personal engagement by local actors with officials is where we should be looking when we know there are going to be at-risk countries or at-risk periods coming up, which we clearly, I mean, that kind of advance warning, I think, is something that we should be thinking about how to provide people. But yeah, somebody here.
Thank you for the panel. My name is Marta Helema. I work for the Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development, called Forum Asia. I was wondering, I mean, in the broader region of Asia, and including India, you see a broader trend of shrinking civic space and an incredible crackdown of freedom of expression, which this is part of. So if you're going to sort of trying to counter these sort of arguments, to what extent are we able to argue against these sort of shutdowns within that narrative?
Who wants to come on that? Jason?
I mean, I'll say, yes, there is a much broader and in some ways much more concerning trend towards shrinking civil space and intentional, I guess you could call it network shutdowns in the real world, you know, whether it's making it harder to form an NGO or making it harder to fundraise for an NGO or making it harder for NGOs to meet and work collectively to do the things that they're driven to do. I think, you know, there's obviously a feedback loop here, right? So, you know, everybody on this panel has talked about the important role civil society can play to help push back against network shutdowns, but if civil society has a hard time just getting funding or being able to establish its legal personality, then they're going to be less effective. But then even when there is civil society on the ground, if the internet as a sort of tool isn't available to them to exercise their freedom of association and peaceful assembly and to express themselves, then their ability to influence the government, not just on internet policy, but on every other policy is limited. And so I think you're very right to point out that these two trends sort of go together. I think a lot of it's, I don't have any sort of data sets to prove this, but I would imagine it would not be, you wouldn't have a hard time finding coincidence between the countries where internet is being restricted and the countries where civil society more broadly is being restricted. So that, you know, that those are sort of where those overlaps are, I think, are the countries we need to be most concerned about and most active on. And I can just say for, you know, my bureau, the Human Rights Bureau at the State Department, we've been working to try to identify those places, figure out what the sort of, what leads to those backward trends and how do we interrupt them.
There are also a lot of donor discussions among philanthropists about the problem, because a number of us in the philanthropic world are seeing the rollback of the ability of us to provide funds to organizations on the ground in many countries. So there are at this stage, I think it's kind of fairly embryonic, but there's a number of discussions taking place about what the appropriate steps might take, up to and including how you can build a civil society with a different form in countries where formal civil society is banned, but where, say, commercial organizations are not banned. So we're looking now at innovative ways of funding, innovative ways of developing legal structures in countries which can evade the kind of controls that are being put in place. But from the point of view that, as we see it, it's a very significant challenge, and you're seeing a very significant rollback on the ability of human rights organizations to operate in many parts of the world, and it's going to require some really serious and imaginative and left field thinking to actually find ways around it in the next, I think, the next 5 to 10 years, because it's not going to be, we're not just going to be able to roll back like a government like Sisi's in Egypt, for example, to suddenly allow all these human rights organizations their legal existence, because that's not the trend. And there's no international pressure on these governments to reverse that trend from any of their traditional allies, whether it's the EU or in the case of Sisi, the United States.
I want to draw your attention to something else, which I think in other rooms is being discussed for sure. I think it's important to recognize how states have now learned to harness the power of social media to their own benefit. The platforms which we would always celebrate and also recommend all the time and fight for free speech and expression, somebody else also has free speech and expression now. And our values are those values, and so we don't want to shut the other one down. But the shouting online is now also being matched and paralleled offline. we've seen how the platforms are being used in the country where First Amendment is so sacrosanct and how it's being used. I think the recognition that there is real online harassment, which is a form of censorship, sometimes flows under the radar. The use of end-to-end encrypted chat messaging services, which we all love, and there would be no, and that's why it's so hard for people like us who don't want to become censors ourselves in order to understand that. But political parties from every spectrum are very sophisticated in now orchestrating internet mobs. So it's no longer as simple as the state saying you won't speak anything and I might have justiciable rights which I can go either to the judiciary or start yelling saying, oh my God, look, the state is stopping me. State is not stopping you. Now there are very effective proxies which will stop you. So that maturity in how to use the platforms and how sophisticated they are in that. So if 500 people on Twitter are going to start targeting me for saying something, anything which they don't like, and it's not one party, or it's not always just the ruling one, it could be other parties also. And if I'm a woman, of course, there has to be sexual violence or at least threats start coming in a jiffy, I would say, and get very visual about it. But what it does in terms of speakers and how it is a form of censorship, that's now a very large part of how elections are run or how states actually govern about issues. So that drowning out is happening on a daily basis. And that doesn't get covered in the big thing about, these are not clampdowns, these are not formal structures of, these are those gray zone areas where I cannot go to the police and say, oh, actually there was incitement to violence. And this doesn't fall in any of the categories we lawyers have created for now. So those gray zones are really being used for all of these purposes. The second thing I want to say is that, and this is because we've been doing a lot of work, which is not this work, and I'm very fascinated about it. If I were not so appalled, that's the time I'm so fascinated. It's that how sophisticated it is, because we live in post-Freud world where mind does so many unconscious things. And its use of these platforms for unconscious messaging. The messaging also is very targeted. It uses the correct vernacular. It takes those issues and it wraps it up into the political party agenda. And it's bombarded 5 WhatsApp messages every day at a time or every hour. And we've heard people say, you know, I support XYZ, but if you see all those WhatsApp messages, you also start to think there must be some truth in there. So this is a mix of, whether you call it false news, fake news, I do not know what platform companies prefer these days, depending on who you're talking to, but, or you talk about, and these are not people who have any formal structures, how they use the platforms to send particular messages, and we don't want content-based restrictions, but it's being used. And I don't think that censorship is happening at those levels where we could actually identify, recognize, and put them into the baskets which we've seen in the past.
Thanks. Well, that's a whole new topic we could have a lot of time to spend on. Deji, do you want to? Yeah.
I just want to salute the Freedom Online Coalition for this statement. It's really extraordinary. Just was looking at it, and it was a very difficult process, I'm assuming, to get it to happen. 30 governments, it's a lot of people to get to convince to come on board, and you know, we in civil society now feel we need to turn this into action. So we're available, and there are a lot of people in the room who are available to help brainstorm and think about how to get this and make an impact with it, but just want to recognize that. I also want to recognize that Mishi alluded to it just now. Internet shutdowns are, for many of the people in the Keep It On Coalition, it's like 1/10 of their work. They have 9 other things that they're working on. So just want to recognize that, that it's really wonderful that they've come together behind this topic, and I feel, you know, have devoted their time when there are other pressing issues like the ones that you just mentioned. But maybe just two quick things. One is that there's an election coming up in Kenya. There are people here at RightsCon who are now strategizing. There's been some talk about disrupting the internet there, Kitanet, and other Kenyan groups. Moses and Grace, Moses from Strathmore and Grace and other folks in the room are strategizing on that. So that's a place where FOC and other people can help. There are rumors that Ecuador is considering or is at risk for a shutdown this weekend on Sunday. Hopefully that won't happen, but when we hear rumors, we look into it and try to do something about it. And then just wanted to invite people. There are 2 more sessions. If you haven't had enough shutdown talk, really important research about to come out from the Open Technology Institute, where they've talked to different stakeholders about what Mishi alluded to in terms of what are the gaps in terms of information sharing and monitoring and contextualizing. So that's really important. And then getting really into the weeds. The very last session is probably the most technical, but it's hacking the licenses that require ISPs and telecommunications companies to shut down the internet. So we're going to try to create one. There are a lot of ones that have been in place for a long time, but we're going to try to create one that can be used so when a company enters the market, the next time they can do it on terms that prevent a shutdown. One last thing, just want to acknowledge the Keep Us Online campaign, which has launched in India. It's a huge, huge deal. Mishi's new tracker and that civil society. There are folks, Ritu's here from Digital Empowerment Foundation India. India is a huge, huge part of this fight, and want to acknowledge that. Would have liked to have gotten members from Keep Us Online on the stage more because it's really a big deal. It's a very sophisticated and smart campaign, and check it out, keepusonline.in. Thank you.
Thanks, Deji. Any final, before we wrap up, any final kind of comments or questions to the panel?
Is there time? Oh, go
Sorry,
ahead,
yeah.
Moses.
Mine is very short. My name is Moses Karanja from Strathmore University, and we are researching on most of these things in the African region. When you look at most of the reasons behind the incidences that we have experienced and documented, as much as they may have varying explanations and projections, you have exams cheating, you have protests, you have elections, you have all these. Fundamentally, it's a question of a political actor taking control of communication systems in a country and assuming a legal position or assuming superiority over the laws to direct how that society will communicate. And that's why even during the Ethiopian protests, they talked about exams. But if you looked keenly, what had just happened is that the Oromo protesters who were challenging a government that is taking over their land, they had executed a perfect, I would say, citizen disobedience. They had leaked the exam online, and so the government looked very bad in light of that because they had denied that had happened, and then when the students went for the exam, it had to be postponed. So when they realize they are losing clout on the political protest and these guys are gaining, that's when they shut down the internet. When you go to Uganda, when they're shutting down the internet during the protest, it's because the incumbent president, who has been there for 26 years, was struggling to find support and felt like, any form of violence will delegitimize me, whether I have won or not, because of course he has the numbers, but it's about the legitimacy and all the kind of things. So what I'm trying to say about all these things is, the more we improve on the political discourse and engagement and democratic values as was raised over there, the more we will manage to deal with some of these things. Because trust me, no government will consider laws or statements or when what is at risk is a 5-year term. So between losing 900 million Kenya shillings and getting another 5-year term, trust me, you can keep your 900 million because that is the situation. So yes, let's increase the political engagement, both in the formal setups and the informal setups, and especially the business community. You have a massive leverage in shaping out the thinking of governments in the regions. Thank you.
Thanks, Moses.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Dua. I'm from Tunisia. My question is about the Freedom Online Coalition members. What will happen if one of the members do not respect the commitment written in the statement?
Thanks very much. Yeah, Jason, over to you on that one.
I'll address Moises' comment, and
At least could do the other one, yeah.
no, so it's a good question, and Andrew mentioned at the beginning that there is a ongoing process, actually now a couple years old, where we started with a broad strategic review of the coalition coming out of the meeting in Mongolia, and that is resulting in a number of things, one of which is revision of our terms of reference. So the terms of reference are kind of like the organizing statutes. Yeah, and we had our first, our original terms of reference were established in Nairobi now almost 5 years ago, and they were not particularly detailed. And so there's a recognition through the strategic review that we needed to be clearer about how we're organized, and that includes what our commitments are. And so we've had a couple consultations here on the margins of RightsCon, and the terms of reference are due to be finalized and made public at the Stockholm Internet Forum in about 6 weeks. So in there, among other things, we are talking about the criteria for membership, so what we expect from members, which I think was always implicit, but was never explicit. And we've seen that it's more, very useful to have that be a bit more explicit and publicly transparent. And then also procedures for suspending members, which we never had before. And so our goal in putting that down on paper is not to all of a sudden start suspending as many members as possible. We still want to keep the coalition broad and open. But it is useful to know how we would go through that exercise if and when a member were to sort of significantly fall below their commitments.
Yeah. I'm going to do a quick 2-minute roundup. Fazia, do you want to go first, and then any remarks you want to make? Yeah.
So I'll do a combination, because I do think Misha's comments earlier were very important. And I'm going to steal from some of her words from the brilliant session yesterday in Human Rights Watch about the idea of reframing, and that instead of trying to think through what is going to be least restricting on rights, we need to think through what is going to ensure that everyone can share safely and openly on these platforms. And I think that, I don't think Facebook could have said it better about the idea that is our entire mission. How can we ensure, thank you. No, you should actually. How can we ensure that our users can share openly and safely on these platforms? And part of that includes our recognition that, I think my manager says this all the time, social media platforms are very much a mirror of what is happening on the ground. And we recognize that violence against women online, which is something that we are very aware of, and we have huge initiatives around safety for women online. We are also aware that that can translate into real life violence. In sub-Saharan Africa, we haven't ignored the connection between rising hateful comments against ethnic minorities on social media platforms and what that means out in the streets. And what that means is that we're aware that that is a barrier to people being able to share openly and safely. And which is partly why we have our community standards, which we've also recognized a lot of users actually don't know. Not only do they not know what our standards are, they don't even know they can report the content. So that exacerbates the whole situation. So we have several initiatives where we have to go on the ground, and it's what might seem basic to many people in this room, but we literally walk through people. This is the button you press in order to report the content. This is the other button you press to tell us that it's hateful and why, and this is where it goes. So, there's on that level, but then we've also recognized that more than just reporting the content, we need actors pushing against violence. So we have several initiatives counter speech initiatives, like in Rwanda and in Kenya, where we work with schools and universities so that way they can create counter messaging. So the point I'm trying to make is that as Facebook, we recognize that there are several things that we're still learning and combating and trying to ensure that we cover, but we are I think social media platforms are becoming a lot more aware of real life harm and what that means. And I don't think it should be frightening for anyone who's pro-free speech to be thinking about those things. So yeah, last plug-in, fantastic statement, and eager to hear as much as possible from the participants here.
Thanks. Yeah, Mishi, 1 minute wrap up. We need to finish, but any final thoughts?
Thank you for the statement, and I hope more people think about this in a more granular way, because the realities are a little more different. I also would like to get more data. The more empirical data we have, the more in terms of economic losses we have, the better, the well-equipped we are in order to deal with these issues. I also just don't want to dismiss each time a law enforcement officer or a government official comes up and expresses their concern and says, here, there is a problem, do you have a real solution for it? That's why in my consultations, whether it's on online harassment or internet free speech, we've started now bringing the cybercrime people quite a lot, and to understand what they deal with, how they deal with, and what are their concerns. And that's why I think GNI is saying that we're going to have a one-pager statement is useful, because they're also looking for ways and tools and help in order to navigate this all. I also want to say that some people in the government know about how internet works, so I'm thankful for that. And I think it's incumbent upon us that those of us who perhaps sit in the middle somewhere and have the ability to break it down into simple to understand issues, we should do that. And the technologists should not sit in their elitist aura, and neither should the policy people or the government or everyone else. We all get together, and that's why I'm going to send Facebook a bill for using my words, but I think it's absolutely right. It's not about the least restrictive way to restrict your rights, but it's what increases the discourse most is what we all should be talking about.
Thanks. Hoost, any final thoughts?
Yeah, but I would like to end this session not too depressed, with a little bit sliver of hope. Of course, it's a tragic development, and it's a trend that is developing. But on the other hand, the lack of knowledge, as pointed out by Andrew, in many countries is also an opening for us, people which are striving for a free, open, and secure internet, to on all these different levels of actors, states, companies, civil society, to exercise political pressure on the governments. And through this, I believe, and there are great examples of states changing their view, we can actually try to move forward on a world with less internet shutdowns. Thanks.
Jason.
Thank you, Andrew, for moderating, and thanks to the wonderful panel and a great audience. I think I know a bit about how the internet operates. I think I'm constantly struggling to understand how the internet works. But RightsCon is one of the best places to come to learn from all of you about what's working, what's not working. I just want to end by kind of underscoring the importance of all of you and the research that you do, the advocacy that you do in informing us as members of government as to what we should be paying attention to and the issues that we should be trying to address. So to the extent that this statement is useful, that's fantastic. It's really in many ways a byproduct of all the great work that you all have been doing. And its utility will also be largely in your hands to the extent that you're able to take it forward and use it with governments and others. So look forward to working with you all on that.
Thanks very much, Jason. And can you show your appreciation for a really great panel? Thank you.